In this episode, we step back from individual security tools and look at the thinking frameworks that help you decide what matters, what to fix first, and how to justify those decisions in a way that other people can understand. Beginners often experience security as a long list of scary problems, and that feeling can lead to two extremes: panic, where everything seems urgent, or fatigue, where nothing seems worth doing because the list never ends. Vulnerability and standards thinking is how mature environments avoid both extremes by creating shared language for describing weaknesses and shared expectations for what good looks like. On the Linux Plus exam, you are expected to recognize terms like common vulnerabilities and exposures, CVE, and common vulnerability scoring system, CVSS, and to understand how baseline standards such as CIS Benchmarks influence hardening decisions. You may also see Open Security Content Automation Protocol, OpenSCAP, mentioned as a way to check systems against defined rules in a consistent way. The goal here is not to become a full-time vulnerability manager, but to build a beginner-safe mental model of how these pieces fit together so you can reason about risk, prioritize fixes, and understand why organizations care about repeatable standards. Before we continue, a quick note. This audio course is a companion to our course companion books. The first book is about the exam and provides detailed information on how to pass it best. The second book is a Kindle-only ebook that contains 1,000 flashcards that can be used on your mobile device or Kindle. Check them both out at cyber.author.me in the Bare Metal Study Guide series. Start with the basic idea of a vulnerability, because it is not the same as a general risk or a general threat. A vulnerability is a specific weakness in software, configuration, or design that can be exploited to cause harm, such as allowing unauthorized access, leaking data, or crashing a service. A threat is something that might act against you, like an attacker, malware, or even accidental misuse. And a risk is the combination of the likelihood that the threat will exploit the vulnerability and the impact if it happens. This distinction matters because vulnerability lists alone do not tell you what to do first, since not every vulnerability is equally likely to be exploited in your environment. For example, a vulnerability in a service that is not installed or not reachable is less relevant than a vulnerability in a public-facing service with a known exploit. Standards thinking complements vulnerability thinking by focusing on the baseline configuration state that reduces common weaknesses even when you do not know every new issue yet. When you can separate vulnerability, threat, and risk in your mind, you can explain security decisions clearly instead of relying on fear or vague language. Common vulnerabilities and exposures, CVE, is essentially a naming system for known vulnerabilities, and its purpose is coordination. Without a shared identifier, different vendors and researchers might describe the same issue using different names, making it hard to track whether you are affected and whether a fix exists. A CVE identifier gives a common reference point, so advisories, patches, scanners, and news can all talk about the same vulnerability unambiguously. For Linux administrators, CVEs show up in package update notes, distribution security advisories, and vulnerability scanning outputs. The important thing to understand is that a CVE does not automatically mean your system is compromised. It means a specific weakness is known to exist in certain versions or configurations. Your job is to determine whether your environment matches the affected conditions and then decide what remediation is appropriate. That remediation might be patching, disabling a feature, applying a configuration change, or mitigating exposure by reducing network access. The CVE label is the starting point for investigation, not the end of the story. Common Vulnerability Scoring System, CVSS, is a framework for describing the severity of a vulnerability in a standardized way, often resulting in a numeric score and a severity category. The point of CVSS is to provide a consistent set of factors that influence how bad a vulnerability could be, such as how it can be exploited, how much access is needed, and what the potential impact is. This is useful because it lets organizations compare vulnerabilities using the same vocabulary and prioritize at least roughly across different products. However, a critical beginner lesson is that CVSS is not the same as your local risk, because it is a general score that may not account for your specific environment. A high-scoring vulnerability might not matter much if the vulnerable component is not exposed, while a medium score vulnerability might be urgent if it affects a core service that is heavily exposed and easily targeted. Mature organizations often combine CVSS with contexts such as asset importance, exposure, exploit availability, and compensating controls. For Linux Plus learners, you want to understand that CVSS helps prioritize, but it is not a perfect decision engine by itself. Another piece of vulnerability thinking is understanding what vulnerability management actually looks like as a lifecycle rather than as a one-time task. Systems evolve, packages update, configurations drift, and new CVEs are published continuously. So the process involves discovery, assessment, prioritization, remediation, and verification. Discovery can come from scanning, vendor advisories, or monitoring. Assessment involves confirming whether you are affected and how exposed you are. Prioritization uses severity, exposure, and business impact to decide what to do first. Remediation can include patching or configuration changes, and verification is confirming the fix truly applied and did not break expected behavior. Standards thinking supports this lifecycle because it provides a baseline, meaning you are not starting from scratch every time a new CVE appears. If a system is already hardened to a known good baseline, the attack surface is reduced, and some vulnerabilities become less exploitable or less impactful. This is why organizations invest in baselines, because they reduce the cost and chaos of responding to constant change. CIS Benchmarks enter the story as an example of baseline guidance that is widely referenced. Center for Internet Security, CIS. Benchmarks are detailed configuration recommendations for specific operating systems and applications, and they typically describe settings that reduce common risks, such as disabling unnecessary services, enforcing strong authentication policies, and tightening permissions. The core idea is that if many organizations face similar threats, a shared baseline can capture best practices so each team does not have to reinvent the same hardening decisions. For beginners, it is useful to treat a benchmark as a checklist of configuration expectations that aim to make a system safer by default. At the same time, benchmarks are not always one-size-fits-all, because a recommendation that improves security can sometimes reduce compatibility or break a specific application workflow. That means standards thinking is not blind obedience. It is understanding the intention behind recommendations and applying them in a way that fits your environment. Linux Plus questions often test whether you recognize that benchmarks exist and are used for hardening and compliance, not whether you can quote every recommendation. Open Security Content Automation Protocol, OpenSCAP, is a way to automate standards checking and security content evaluation, which matters because manual auditing does not scale. At a high level, OpenSCAP is associated with a framework of machine-readable security content and scanning that can evaluate whether a system meets certain policy rules. This can include checking configuration settings, verifying that certain options are enabled, and producing reports that show pass or fail against a defined profile. The beginner-friendly way to think about it is that OpenSCAP helps you measure a system against a standard consistently, which reduces guesswork and improves repeatability. It also supports the idea of continuous compliance, where you regularly check whether systems remain aligned with policy over time rather than assuming they stay correct forever. This matters because configuration drift is real, and changes made under pressure can gradually move a system away from the baseline. Automated checks make drift visible, which gives teams a chance to correct it before it becomes an incident. The exam-level point is that OpenSCAP is connected to automated assessment of security configuration and standards profiles. When you combine vulnerability thinking with standards thinking, you get a more balanced approach than either one alone. Vulnerability thinking tells you about specific, known weaknesses that need targeted attention, often driven by updates and disclosures. Standards thinking tells you how to reduce baseline exposure and maintain a stable, defensible configuration posture. A system that follows a hardened baseline tends to have fewer unnecessary services and fewer weak defaults, which reduces the number of ways an attacker can leverage a CVE even if one exists. Conversely, focusing only on baselines without patching can leave known flaws unaddressed, which is risky when exploits are available. The skill is to use both, applying baseline hardening to reduce the general attack surface and using vulnerability management to handle specific new issues as they appear. This dual approach also makes communication easier, because you can explain that you are both maintaining a standard posture and responding to new threats. That clarity is valuable in teams because it reduces confusion about whether security work is proactive or reactive. A common beginner trap is to treat a CVE list as a to-do list in strict numerical order, but that can lead to wasted effort if you do not account for exposure and asset importance. If a vulnerability affects a package that is installed but never used, or a service that is not reachable, it might not deserve urgent attention compared to vulnerabilities on critical systems. Another trap is to chase a perfect benchmark score without considering business needs, which can break functionality and cause teams to disable controls later out of frustration. A third trap is to assume that a tool output is automatically correct, when in reality scanners can have false positives and policies can be misapplied. Mature practice involves validating findings and understanding the reasoning behind each recommendation. The exam is often testing whether you can think in this balanced way, where you respect the tools and standards but still apply judgment. The key is to let standards and scoring inform decisions, not replace human reasoning. Prioritization is the real heart of this topic, and it is worth articulating what good prioritization looks like at a conceptual level. You prioritize based on a combination of severity, exposure, exploitability, and impact. Severity is what CVSS tries to capture in a general way. Exposure asks whether the vulnerable component is reachable by an attacker, such as being internet-facing or accessible from untrusted segments. Exploitability asks whether there are known exploits, whether the vulnerability is easy to trigger, and whether it requires special conditions. Impact asks what would happen if it were exploited, such as data loss, system compromise, or service outage. When you combine these factors, you can make a decision that is defensible, even if it is not perfect. This is important because security work always involves trade-offs, and being able to explain the trade-off is part of being effective. For Linux Plus learners, being able to describe these factors clearly will help you answer scenario-style questions that ask what you should do first. Verification and evidence are also part of standards thinking because audits and internal reviews rely on proof rather than promises. If you say a system is hardened, you need a way to demonstrate it, and repeatable scans or configuration checks provide that evidence. If you say a vulnerability is fixed, you need to confirm the patched version is actually in place and that the vulnerable configuration is no longer present. This is where tools like OpenSCAP and benchmark profiles become practical because they can generate consistent reports that show current state. The beginner lesson is that security is not only about doing the right thing once. It is about being able to show that the right thing is still true later. That is why documentation and repeatable measurement matter, even though they can feel administrative. In real environments, evidence-driven security is what makes decisions defensible and reduces argument based on opinion. By the end of this episode, you should be able to explain how CVE identifiers help the world talk about the same vulnerability consistently, and how CVSS provides a standardized way to describe severity that supports prioritization. You should also understand that standards like CIS Benchmarks represent baseline hardening guidance that reduces common risks and provides a shared configuration target. OpenSCAP represents the idea of automated evaluation against machine-readable security content, which supports repeatability, drift detection, and evidence-driven reporting. Most importantly, you should be able to connect these pieces into a single mindset. Use standards to reduce your attack surface broadly. Use vulnerability information to address specific known issues, and use scoring and automation to prioritize and verify without falling into blind checklist behavior. That mindset is what turns security from an endless list of unrelated tasks into a manageable, explainable process. It is also the mindset that will help you on Linux Plus questions that test practical reasoning, because you will be able to justify why one action matters more than another in a given context.
Thanks for listening. For more audio courses, daily newsletters, and more, please visit baremetalcyber.com.